Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're plunging into a really fascinating historical paradox. We're looking at an economic system that, was once championed by the most powerful elites, but now it's often just called an economic fallacy. We are, of course, talking about mercantilism. Our mission today is to really dive deep into a piece from Mises Daily that explores this whole concept. We want to unpack mercantilism not just as some, dusty relic, but as something with surprisingly enduring relevance. See what lessons it holds.
That's right. And, mercantilism isn't just a chapter in an old history book. It's really a crucial window, a window into how power, economics, and state control have always been tangled up together. Understanding the system, I think, gives us a much clearer view on similar debates that are still happening today, sometimes just, under different names.
Okay, let's unpack this then. The Mises Daily article really frames mercantilism as an economic fallacy, which is pretty strong language, right? Especially since it had such good press from the 17th to the 19th centuries, what was actually at the core of this system.
Well, it's provocative because, at its peak in 17th and 18th century Europe, mercantilism was essentially statism, meaning a really strong belief in the state's central role in controlling the economy, its main goal. Build imperial power. And it did this by giving out special subsidies and monopolistic privileges to groups the state favored. Definitely not a free market.
So a highly state-controlled economy, very specific national goals. Our reading mentions encouraging exports, discouraging imports, and this relentless drive for bullion, gold, and silver. What's really fascinating there is the idea that the bullion itself was seen as wealth, like the actual treasure, not just a way to buy stuff.
Precisely. And if you connect that to the bigger picture, it wasn't just about, a positive trade balance. It was fundamentally about national power, the state directing economic activity. Often this flew in the face of what later economists would call, economic rationality. The belief was that wealth, especially gold and silver, was finite. So for one nation to get richer, another had to get poorer, a zero-sum game.
Right. Accumulating bullion meant accumulating strength.
Oh.
Okay, so given that framework state control, bullion obsession, how did it actually play out in policy? Can you give us a concrete example of this wall of privilege the article talks about?
Oh, yeah. The English Navigation Acts are a perfect example. Really classic mercantilism. These laws were around for centuries, and they specifically restricted foreign shipping and manufacturing. Basically, goods from the colonies had to be on English ships with English crews, often landing in England first before going anywhere else. The direct beneficiaries were clearly English merchants and producers.
And the article notes these acts were a huge factor leading to the American Revolution.
Exactly. The colonies felt choked by these restrictions on their trade. It became intolerable.
It's kind of ironic, isn't it? Policies meant to strengthen the empire actually helped tear it apart. So, okay, certain groups benefited merchants, manufacturers, connected landowners. But who paid the hidden costs? The source says consumers often lost out. Price distortions, trade being hampered. That means preventing countries from specializing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Forcing a nation to make things inefficiently at home instead of benefiting from, global specialization, which costs everyone more. And this raises that key question: who really benefits when the state steps in so heavily? Adam Smith's critique is crucial here. He basically said these laws are only fallacies if you look at the whole society, not just the producers getting handouts. That special privilege, it came at the expense of the remainder of its citizens. Higher prices, fewer choices for regular people.
So Smith just completely flipped the script. What was his most fundamental challenge? That famous line about consumption?
Yes. Consumption is the sole end and purpose of all production. That was revolutionary. Smith's core insight shifted the focus entirely, away from the producer and the state towards the individual consumer. He argued that under mercantilism, the consumer was ultimately sacrificed to that of the producer. Think about that Scottish linen yarn example in the reading. Mercantilists restricted foreign linen imports to help domestic spinners. But Smith pointed out, that just made the raw material more expensive for the domestic weavers who used the yarn, so it hurt their competitiveness. It showed how interconnected everything was.
Wow, that's a great illustration of the ripple effect. Protecting one group hurts another. Unintended consequences 101. Did Smith make a similar point about other policies like export bounties?
He absolutely did. Bounties, or subsidies for exports, were another mercantilist favorite. Make domestic goods cheaper abroad, right? But Smith pointed out, who pays for these bounties? The home consumer does, through taxes. So again, it looked like national progress, but it was often just redistributing wealth from the many to the few, the politically connected, a hidden tax, basically.
We've covered trade, finance.
Yeah.
But what about the people, the labor? How did mercantilists view workers? The article mentions they were big on full employment, but it sounds like it came at a steep price for individual freedom.
Oh, absolutely. The mercantilist view of labor, as the article shows, was very utilitarian, almost dehumanizing. Thinkers like William Petty literally saw labor as capital material, just another resource for the state to exploit for national power. And Henry Fielding, the famous writer, actually wrote that society had a right to insist on the labor of the poor. It's quite chilling. George Berkeley even suggested temporary servitude to cure idleness. It wasn't about dignity, it was resource management.
That is stark. And the idea of children as young as 4 being sent to public workhouses. William Temple proposed that. It really makes you question the whole social contract back then, especially for the poor. Sounds less like employment, more like forced labor.
It really does paint a grim picture, and the Elizabethan era put these ideas into law. The Statute of Artificers in 1563. Comprehensive labor control. If you worked the land, you couldn't just leave if you were over 12. Unemployed, you were forced into agriculture. And they set maximum wage rates. Even Queen Elizabeth set minimum wages for textile workers. Total state control over who worked where and for how much.
It's just amazing. These weren't just abstract ideas, but actual laws impacting lives so directly. And the article points out these wage controls often backfired, leading to undue dislocations, unemployment, misery, particularly under James I and Charles I.
Exactly. It's a powerful reminder that policies aiming for order, even full employment, can cause immense suffering if they ignore market realities and basic liberty. That road to national power was pretty rough for a lot of ordinary people. Economic control often has serious social consequences.
Okay, so beyond trade and labor, what about finance? The article calls them inflationists and champions of the poor debtors. How does that work? Seems contradictory.
Well, yeah, it sounds strange. Their thinking was, sort of, that inflation wouldn't really hurt the poor because wages would lag behind prices, making labor cheaper for employers.
Right.
And debtors, they'd benefit because they could pay back their debts with currency that was worth less. But, and this is key, the source suggests this debtors' relief wasn't usually about the actual poor. It was often a scheme benefiting the upper classes, wealthy merchants, big landowners, who were often the biggest debtors. It helped them reduce their liabilities.
Can you give an example? The article mentions colonial Massachusetts. That seems really early for this kind of thing.
Oh, absolutely. Back in the 1640s in Massachusetts, during an economic downturn, they passed these debtors' relief laws. Things like forcing creditors to accept property instead of cash, at values the government basically inflated, and using inflated currency for payments. And crucially, it was the upper house, the Council of Magistrates, who passed these laws. The people benefiting were often the wealthy, the politically connected elite. So typically, mercantilists using state power to help specific influential groups.
And Massachusetts also gave us, apparently, the first governmental paper money in the Western world in 1690, which, as the article notes, failed pretty spectacularly and was tied up with these proposals for inflationary land banks. So another example of state intervention in finance, questionable outcomes, benefiting certain people.
Absolutely. It shows this recurring pattern, doesn't it? State-directed finance, often inflationary, supposedly for the public good or debt relief, but in practice, often served politically connected interests and sometimes led to instability when trust broke down or just defied economic sense.
Now, the article mentions Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, and his enthusiastic welcome of mercantilists. He saw their interventions as, like, progressive steps towards full employment and managing demand. That connection feels really relevant today, doesn't it?
It really does. It just shows how similar ideas can pop up again and again, just viewed through a new lens, maybe repackaged. Keynes saw them as Tory regimes, but he admired their willingness to actively direct the economy towards certain goals. What this deep dive shows, I think, is that these historical economic systems, even ones later economists called fallacious, they often reappear, especially these themes of state control, central planning, special privilege. Maybe it's a recurring temptation, believing central authority can manage the economy better.
So what's the takeaway for us, for the listener today? This isn't just history, right? It feels like a look at this constant tension between state power and individual economic freedom, how that plays out. This dive into mercantilism, it really shows a system built on state control, special favors, sometimes exploitation, all for national power. It's quite a story.
Absolutely. From those navigation acts that fueled revolution to the compulsory labor laws, the inflationary schemes in Massachusetts, the source material really paints a vivid picture of an economic philosophy that put the producer and the state way ahead of the consumer and individual liberty, a real counterpoint to free markets.
Yeah, it definitely gives you a new perspective on how economic policy shapes societies, sometimes in ways we don't immediately see. This deep dive really highlights that timeless lesson, I think. Pursuing national power through heavy economic control, while it might seem appealing on the surface, often comes at the cost of individual freedom and maybe even broader prosperity. That tension is still with us.
Exactly. And as you reflect on all this, here's maybe a provocative thought to leave you with. In our own time, with all the talk about global competition protecting domestic industries, how might elements of that old mercantilist thinking be subtly creeping back into economic debates today? And more importantly, what potential costs might we be overlooking if we go down that path again?
Something to definitely think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.